Hello, everyone. I'm Najib Baki, founder and managing director at Tinsley Park, a private equity and an investment advisory firm. Welcome to another episode of Tinsley Park Talks, which is a global networking and leadership platform where we invite industry legends from finance to tech and from policy experts to thinkers. In these digital interviews, we talk about entrepreneurship, investing, and all other topics of life. Today's topic is strategy, particularly creating value through strategy in any business. And our guest is Felix Oberholzer G, who is the Andreas Andreessen Professor of Business Administration in the Strategy Unit at Harvard Business School. A member of the faculty since 2003, Professor Oberholzer G received his master's degree summa cum laude and his PhD in economics from the University of Zurich. His first faculty position was at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. He currently teaches competitive strategy in executive education programs such as the Program for Leadership Development, the Senior Executive Program for China, and in a program for media executives titled Effective Strategies for Media Companies. His course, Strategies Beyond the Market, is a popular elective class for second-year MBA students. Professor Oberholzer G won numerous awards for excellence in teaching, including the Harvard Business School Class of 2006 Faculty Teaching Award for Best Teacher in the Core Curriculum, and the 2002 Helen Carden Moss Anvil Award for Best Teacher in the Wharton MBA program. Prior to his academic career, Professor G he served as a managing director of Simo Electronics, which is a Swiss-based process control company. And Professor G is also the author of Better, Simpler Strategy, a book I highly recommend our viewers to read, and a book that we're actually going to speak about in this episode. Without further ado, welcome to the show, Professor.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Najib.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Pleasure. Thank you so much for joining. So, Professor, tell us about your upbringing, your career journey so far, where you come from, and how did you end up at Harvard?
Do you have 7 hours?
Sure, we'll edit it. Keep going. We'll just take the important bits and pieces.
Okay. So I grew up in Switzerland, and I got educated in Switzerland. I spent most of my time in Switzerland, and then I switched career from the corporate sector to being at a university. And my first job was actually in Philadelphia. In the late 1990s, I joined the Wharton School. And then I taught at different business schools, mostly on the East Coast, moving actually against my weather preferences further and further north, and ended up at Harvard Business School, which turned out to be a really great place for me. One, because obviously it's a great academic institution, but also Harvard is one of these places where many faculty are really interested in what happens in practice, how companies are run, the issues that companies face, the kinds of problems that managers grapple with. And that happens to be a good match with my own interests and my own preferences. So I've been at Harvard now for almost 20 years. It's hard to believe, but it's true.
Wow, great story. So, today we're going to talk about your book. The episode is named Strategy. It's just an episode on strategy, business strategy. So what I'm going to do now before we talk about your book is show the book to the audiences. And there's something funny going on with this book, right? It's a green color book.
That's right. Yes. What a surprise.
It's blending really well with my background, though. It shows you how assimilated I've become to the book, and the book became of me.
That's very funny.
Without further ado, let's talk about what was the sort of thought process and the decision behind writing this book, Professor?
I've been teaching strategic management for quite some time, and I noticed that one of the challenges in thinking about strategy is that it seems to be this really complicated topic for many people. You know, the sense that you have to be very senior, you have to have a lot of experience. In fact, if you're starting early on in your career, you can't really be a strategic thinker. And I know that's not true. I know that fundamentally, if you think about the concept of strategy and what it's trying to do, it's actually not difficult. And I think many individuals experience it as really challenging, but fundamentally, it's not a complicated issue. And so I wanted to write a book that reflected how I started to teach strategy, how I had many examples out of ways of explaining what strategy is all about that seemed to resonate with many participants, both in executive education, but then also in the MBA programs. And so think of the book as sort of a collected pieces of wisdom, insights that I had, insights that what I learned from both the students in my class and the research that I did over this time. And so the net result is this book, Better, Simpler Strategy, where simple is really important. That's in part what I really cared about.
That's pretty cool. So you're saying that there's no discussions about standard deviations or coefficient correlations?
No, not really. I mean, it's data driven in the sense that we want to make good decisions that are based on data. And I'm doing this. I'm essentially looking at different companies, some of them doing well, some of them doing not so well, and trying to figure out what makes a difference. What's the result of their strategy? So not sure about you, but when you go, say, to Home Depot or Lowe's, the two companies really seem sort of the same, right? I mean, one corporate color is orange and the other one is blue, but other than that, they're the same company, same number of stores, same products. And yet you see that Home Depot much more financially successful than Lowe's. And the question is why? And that often has to do with the kinds of strategies that companies employ that then yield better financial results over long periods of time.
Makes sense. Professor, you talk about the two interesting lessons and messages you learned over the course of your career that shaped the way you wrote this book. Do you mind sharing those lessons?
Yes, I'm happy to share. The first is that you should be wildly optimistic about the potential of a company, any company really, anywhere on the planet, the potential of a company to be much more successful than it is today. And that optimism comes from the data. If you look at variation in financial performance, you will always find some company that is in a similar industry, that is at a similar point in time, in a similar company, and the company does so much better than some of its rivals. And so every manager should have this sense that, oh my God, if we did things better, if we had an improved strategy, actually the result, the financial results that we achieve can be much better. I give you a little bit of an intuition. Say we rank companies in a particular industry from 1 to 100. And at the beginning, you're exactly 50, at 50, you're average. Now I move you from rank 50 to rank 40. So I'm not making you a superstar firm. You're not Apple. But say you're 10 ranks better than you were to begin with. And that would increase your return on invested capital by almost 22%. So there's a big advance that is possible, that is within reach for almost any organization. And then the second thing that I learned, which I find quite interesting, is when you ask, so what do companies do to achieve that higher level of performance? What you find is that it's really actually two really simple things. They're creating more value for their customers, or they're creating more value for their employees. Only two things, and they make all the difference.
Great, great. So that's a great segue to the next question. And you talk about in your book the concept of a value stick. And on that value stick is how you measure true value created. Do you want to share that concept with us?
So a value stick has 4 elements. At the top is willingness to pay, and then is price, cost, and willingness to sell. So willingness to pay, obviously that's the customer. That's the most the customer would ever be willing to pay for a product or a service. Charge me a little more, $1 more, and I'm better off not buying. The difference between willingness to pay and price, that is value that goes to the customer. So you were willing to pay, say, $10, but the price was only $8.50. So that $1.50 is value for the customers. The difference between prices and costs, that's the margin of the company. In this particular case, it's operating margins. And then willingness to sell at the bottom of the value stick. That's probably the least intuitive of the four elements. Think of a supplier or think of an employee who wants to work at a company. There is a minimum compensation that you expect. And if you will make less than that minimum compensation, you're not interested. It's not actually your salary, how much you actually make, but it's that minimum expectation. And the minimum expectation tells us something about how attractive the job is for a particular person. So if a job is out of this world amazing, really fantastic, then it takes a little less money to attract me to this company. And so willingness to sell falls. Right. If a job is maybe physically very demanding, then it takes more money to make the person do the job. And as a result, willingness to sell goes up. So the difference between willingness to pay and willingness to sell, that's total value created. Right? If you ask of any company, how much value does the company actually create? Take willingness to pay, take willingness to sell, it's that difference. And then value gets split three ways. Some of it goes to customers. That's the difference between willingness to pay and price. Some of it goes to employees. That's the difference between their compensation and willingness to sell. And then the middle wedge is the profit of the company, the operating margin that the company gets to keep.
Brilliant, brilliant. So let's break down this willingness to pay and willingness to sell in a few case studies, shall we? You talk about Best Buy and you talk about Gap in your book. Maybe we start with Best Buy?
Yes, absolutely. So Best Buy is a story of willingness to pay. And I don't know if you remember now, Najib, but say 10, 15 years ago, we all thought that Best Buy would go out of business. Right? For sure. So it was like it lost a lot of money in a very short period of time. And it seemed like there's just really no way to compete with Amazon, and everybody loved to go online and buy their electronics products online.
Circuit City went out of business, so you're like, okay, Best Buy's next.
Yes, yeah. So that did not make us more optimistic because it just seemed almost inevitable that the company couldn't survive. So they get a new CEO, and one of the first things that they do is instead of building big distribution centers the way we typically do it in e-commerce, they start shipping from every store. And that has a lot of advantages. One is that most stores are relatively close to people. So you beat Amazon in shipping times, that increases willingness to pay. And then also, if I want the product that, say, right now it's only in a store in Florida, it's very unlikely that a customer in Florida wants exactly that product that is not so popular. So Best Buy can ship it to the customer, to the rare customer who wants that individual product. And so they have fewer sales than they would typically have. So willingness to pay goes up because I can get my products fast and I can always get exactly what I want. And then the new CEO, he also goes to Microsoft and Lenovo and Samsung. And he says, well, you can go down the Apple route and you can build these really beautiful retail stores, millions of dollars in expense, or you can build a store inside Best Buy. And that is much cheaper, and you're already right at the place where people are looking for your kinds of products. And so that lowers willingness to sell, creates more margins for the vendors, and then the vendors share these better margins with Best Buy. And what's really remarkable is, as a result of these two things, they go from losing more than $1 billion a quarter to now having returns on invested capital in excess of 20%. I think what it shows is that you have a few initiatives, a few projects that increase willingness to pay or that decrease willingness to sell. And then not surprisingly, you're creating more value. As a result, what happens, of course, you capture more value as well.
Very interesting. What I like about your perspective on this value stick is the emphasis on willingness to sell, because oftentimes, management consultants or strategists always talk about just the revenue item. Very seldom you hear about willingness to sell, and you said it's a little bit less intuitive to understand it, but it's true. If you can reduce your turnover and if you can create that willingness to sell from your employee base, that is very much correlated to the margins that you have in your business. So would love to dig a little deeper in how Gap did it in the next study.
Yeah. Happy to talk about the Gap. Your general observation, I think, is exactly right. We used to put so much, customer centricity was everything, so much focus on the customer. And frankly, not quite as much focus on employees. Right now, of course, because there's such a shortage of labor in many industries, we sort of go through this moment where there's a lot of attention paid to employees. And I think that's probably something that will stay with us, because I think what we're seeing now is if you have a competitive advantage in the market for talent, often that competitive advantage in the market for talent then translates into a competitive advantage in the market for customers. So the Gap is interesting. It did a really neat thing for the workers in its retail stores. As you probably know, Najib, being a retail worker in the United States is quite stressful. You never really know when you can work because the shifts are assigned typically about a week in advance. And so it becomes really hard to plan your life because you never know, am I going to work? Am I not going to work? When will I work? And then because from week to week, sometimes you have more shifts, sometimes you have fewer shifts. The income of the average retail worker fluctuates by about 40% on average from week to week. So it's just stressful. I don't really know when I'm going to work. And as a result, I don't really know how much money I will make. So they do a really simple, elegant thing in that they use an app, and the app essentially creates a marketplace for shifts. So say my daughter's sick, I cannot be at work. I make my shift available, and someone else who would like to have more hours can then take my shift. Or say I'm looking for a little more income at a particular point in time. I can go on the app and I can see who is willing to offer up their shifts, and I can take these shifts. And maybe best of all, if the company scheduled too many shifts or not enough shifts, it can be active on the app as well. And so it can adjust how many people end up working in the stores without hurting anyone's income. The results of this are really quite astounding. The first thing that you'll see is that same-store sales over time, they go up significantly. Why? Well, if people really want to be at work when they're at work, they do a better job. And so you increase willingness to pay, and you're more successful in the relationship with your customers. And then, of course, you lower willingness to sell because you take stress out of people's lives. You make the job a better job. One of my favorite statistics of this experiment when they looked at the results is that, in particular, parents with kids, they reported that they slept much better. Not as many concerns, not as many worries in life. And this, in a sense, is very typical. If you make jobs better for employees, you lower willingness to sell. Often this spills over into increases in willingness to pay. And so you're really creating more value at both ends of the value stick.
That's brilliant.
So this is often true in competition for talent, that the first idea that we have is we just have to pay more, right? And of course, often that's the right thing to do. We want to be generous with employees when it comes to compensation. But just paying more has two disadvantages. The first one is it doesn't really create any value. It just redistributes value from the owners of the firm to the employees.
Right.
The second issue is you don't get much of a selection effect, because if I create a job, say, that is incredibly imaginative, I will attract a lot of people for whom imagination, creativity is really important. If you just attract people by paying a lot, you don't really get a selection effect. Why? Well, because everybody likes money. So you get a random group of people who are just attracted by the fact that you have really generous compensation. I find thinking about ways to actually create better working conditions, that is often as powerful or even more powerful than thinking about just paying people more. You see it now in the Amazon warehouse conversation, where one of the really big things is just safety. How safe is it to work in these places? And maybe making the workplace a safer workplace is as powerful in competition for talent as paying a little more. And so thinking always about both of these things, like when do you adjust compensation, knowing that this is not value creating, you forgo a selection effect, and when do you actually create better work, that those are your two possibilities. And willingness to pay, we know, is a very wide open concept, right? So it's the functional characteristics of a product, it's the design, it's the social connotations that come with the product. There's really so many things go into willingness to pay. And the same is also true for jobs. So many things go into willingness to sell. So you make me show up at work at 9 in the morning, which means I'm going to be stuck in traffic or I'm going to be in overcrowded buses and trains. Is there flexibility? You make me wear a particular uniform, which maybe I feel great about, maybe I feel not so great about. I made a mistake at work. Is someone going to yell at me? And so on. And so there's a million things that influence willingness to sell. And each one of these can be made better. Each one of these can be a source of competitive advantage for the firm in competition for talent.
Excellent, excellent. Professor, you have 6 main parts to the book. Can we go over the different parts, starting with the exceptional performance?
Yes, yeah. So the book basically starts out just having us think about success and where success comes from. That's the first part. And then I say, well, there's this framework, and the first third of the book is mostly thinking about willingness to pay. And it walks you through the main levers, how you might be able to increase willingness to pay. And that is, of course, better products themselves. I talk about complements. Complements are other products and services that help lift willingness to pay. And I talk about network effects. Network effects exist if the adoption of a product increases the value to everyone else. So that's on the willingness to pay side. And then I switch from willingness to pay to willingness to sell. And I think about ways to drive down willingness to sell. So this is better jobs. Like, what do we know about the working conditions that are particularly attractive? This is about creating better relationships with suppliers. Instead of just trying to squeeze suppliers and get an ever better price, what happens if you actually lower the cost of your suppliers? And I talk about productivity and where productivity differences come from. And then the last third of the book is really about implementation. And it's actually a lot of fun to write, in part because, many companies have strategies, and these strategies are sort of beautiful PowerPoint presentations. But
theory-based, yeah.
Much effect in practice. And so what you want is that your strategy really comes alive in the enterprise. Your strategies really live, is felt by everyone who works in the organization. And so there I introduce this concept, this tool called Value Maps, where you create a map that shows how you compete today and how you can use the tool to then figure out how you might compete in the future. And so you can think of the 3 big parts, both sort of as the drivers of willingness to pay, the drivers of willingness to sell, and then a couple of steps in implementation.
Can you give us just a couple of maybe pointers about the actual implementation, how that sets apart a CEO than the other from taking a theoretic strategy to actually putting it to work? What are some lessons that you want to share with the viewers?
So I think there's 2 things that happen when you use these value maps. The first thing is they're radically customer-centric or employee-centric. A value map on the vertical axis is essentially the components of willingness to pay or the components of willingness to sell. If I, as a customer, have to choose between two products, what are the considerations that play a role in that choice? Or if I, as an employee, have to choose between two employers, how do I make that choice? What's driving me to work for company A and not for company B? And then I see on the horizontal axis at the same time, how well do I do on any one of these considerations relative to the competition? And so what's really fabulous about value maps is that they ground you in the reality today. Sometimes you see these exercises where people think about, oh my God, if we could have any strategy we wanted, if we could do, everything is possible, nothing is off the table. And that can be really inspiring, but I don't think it's very useful. Why? Well, because you're a business that has a particular set of assets. You're a business that has a particular set of resources, skills. You have a group of talented people. You can't just do anything. You have to start with where you are today. And the value maps basically show you where you are today, and then they show you how you might compete in the future, but it's always relative to the competition. One of the things that you often see is that some business in an industry has a great idea. Let's do something really attractive, like somehow different. Then before you know it, many other businesses imitate to do exactly the same thing. And as a result, two things happen. Of course, if you copy a good idea, you become a more successful, a better company as well. But at the same time, you also become more similar to the competition.
Right.
And every time you become more similar, there's more pricing pressure in your industry. Think about a customer who decides, think about a customer who wants to decide between A and B. Do I buy from company A? Do I buy from company B? If the two value sticks are exactly the same, how do I decide? Of course, I decide based on price.
Price.
And so if you feel that your customers are very price sensitive, that's actually not an attribute of the customers. That's just because you're essentially no different from everyone else. And so it's just pure old regular price competition. And so the value maps also prevent you from falling into this trap of essentially imitating what others have done. And it highlights the role of creativity and imagination in strategy. Strategy is not complicated, it's simple. It's all about increasing willingness to pay or decreasing willingness to sell. But you need creativity, you need imagination to find novel, different ways of doing it.
Professor, 5 things you learned from your academic career.
Oh my God, 5.
That you talk about, the only 5.
Well, I mean, an academic career is interesting because it has, to our last conversation, it has so much to do with creativity and the imagination, right? You're trying to push the boundaries of what we know, the boundaries of what we understand. In my context, it's the boundaries of where does financial success come from? And so I think being in a profession that has room for creativity, that allows you to be imaginative, that is really fantastic. At the same time, like sometimes people ask, like, are there things you miss about industry compared to academics? And it's definitely true that there's things that you miss. For instance, the sense of team effort, I think, is much greater in a regular business. You work with a group of people to complete a project or make something amazing happen. Compared to that, I think academia is a more lonely job. It's like you have co-authors of course, but you're not typically working, at least in a business school context, you're not typically working in large teams. And so there's pros and cons like any career. In the end, Najib, I'm not really sure whether these choices always make the difference that we expect them to make. If you ask me, like, if I had made different professional choices, say I wouldn't have been in academia, I would have stayed in my corporate career, would I be at a very different place in life, maybe much happier or maybe much less happy? I don't think so. I think we actually have a little bit of research how people gravitate back sort of to their natural state of happiness. And
Mhm.
that sometimes you look at these big life changes, say people who are in a terrible accident or people who win the lottery. And generally speaking, what you find is yes, it's a positive shock or it's a negative shock, but basically people recalibrate to levels of happiness and satisfaction that are not so different. And that's how I pretty much feel about my own career choices. I think it's amazing what I get to do. I really enjoy it. But are there 15,000 other things that I would probably enjoy as much? Yes, I think so.
So what I take away from that answer is that you've reduced your willingness to sell with yourself.
Yes, I think that's right. Yes, I get to do many things that I love to do.
That's great. What is your biggest motivator?
I think on the research front, the biggest motivator often has to do with really novel insights, things that we didn't see so clearly or things that we didn't know. I think that's that's in part why you're doing the work, to really shed light, produce new insights, produce new knowledge. So that feels really fantastic. And then I think the other element that is really important is just what happens when you teach. Uh, as you probably know, at Harvard Business School, teaching is really at the center of our profession. We place a lot of value on teaching. It's a really key component of what we do. And just seeing how in conversation with someone else, the other person's views evolve, my own views evolve. Talking with smart people is really fabulous because you get to see the world a little differently almost every day. And those are the things I think that are most important to me.
That's amazing. For young viewers here, if you have one key leadership advice, students as well as young budding entrepreneurs, what would that one advice be most important?
I think one ambition that you should have always, and I think it doesn't matter whether you run a large organization, whether you start your own company, whether you're early in your career and you're a student, I think every day, did you make someone else's day a little better? Did you somehow contribute to someone else? Could be, I don't know, a fun conversation, could be a slap on the back, could be you're helping out someone in a difficult situation, could be anything really. In the end, I think nothing really feels quite as satisfying as being in the business of creating value for someone else. And then fantastically, in the business context, that happens to be the recipe for financial success also. But it all starts with value creation. So think value, and I think profits will follow in the business world. Think value, and I think a fulfilled life will follow in the personal sphere.
Great. Well, this has been great. I really enjoyed the talk and look forward to staying in touch with you. Thank you so much again. Take care.
Thank you for the invitation, Najib. It was a great pleasure to speak with you.
Same.